Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we dim the lights and step back into a world where power, ambition, and maybe just a little bit of madness danced a very dangerous waltz. We're journeying to Rome, a city you might picture as a stately, timeless monument of stone and faith, but which, in the 9th century, was more like a fever dream of shifting loyalties and sudden, violent turns. You trudge down a muddy cobblestone street, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and a lingering, unsavoury whiff of the nearby Tiber. The great Roman monuments are no longer pristine. The Colosseum is a quarry for new buildings. The ancient forums are little more than grassy fields grazed by sheep. And yet, this is the very heart of Christendom. You hear the clanging of blacksmiths, the distant chanting of monks, and a low hum of constant political intrigue. You probably won't survive this, by the way. The life expectancy here is a grim joke, and the various factions would just as soon stab you in the back as look at you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Post it in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a city built on an unstable foundation, and I'm not just talking about the geology. The papacy, the very institution meant to be the bedrock of the spiritual world, is a political football. Think of it less as a holy office and more as a throne up for grabs in a high-stakes, ruthless game of musical chairs. Every powerful Roman family has a favoured candidate, and they are not above using bribery, blackmail or blunt force to get their man into the top job. The emperor, a title that by this point has become a bit of a historical whisper, still has a say, but it's often a distant, complicated one, and the local Roman nobility holds the real power. It's a system so convoluted you'd need a flowchart the size of a tapestry just to keep track of who's feuding with whom. And the popes themselves? They're less like serene spiritual leaders and more like beleaguered feudal lords, trying to navigate a minefield of alliances and enmities. Now, let's talk about our main character, a man named Formosus. He was a cardinal bishop, a man of some serious clout, and a reputation for being, shall we say, a bit of a political chameleon. He'd been excommunicated once before by Pope John VIII, a rather feisty character who accused Formosus of everything from abandoning his diocese to plotting against the emperor. Mainstream historical fact number 1 for you. John VIII, one of the few popes of the era to actually die of something other than assassination or poisoning, he was bludgeoned to death after a poison plot failed, was convinced Formosus was a traitor. But after John's death, Formosus was quickly reinstated and his reputation was restored, showing you just how fast the winds could shift. It's like being fired from your company, then a week later the CEO gets canned, and the new guy not only rehires you, but makes you his VP. It's an instant karma kind of world, but for the good guys this time. But Formosus was not without his own ambition. He was a man of the cloth, sure, but he was also a man of the Roman nobility, and he had his eyes set on the ultimate prize. Historians still argue whether his ambition was truly about spiritual leadership, or just a desire to gain the ultimate political power in Rome. Was he a pious man simply trying to restore order, or a cunning politician playing the long game? The sources from this period are so biased and contradictory, it's like trying to get the real story of a celebrity scandal by only reading gossip magazines. The problem, as it so often is, was the other powerful families. There was a major rivalry brewing between two factions, one supported by the Spoletan family, a powerful noble house, and another by the rising star of the city's elite. Formosus was firmly in the latter camp, and here's a quirky tidbit for you. Pope John VIII, the one who excommunicated Formosus, was supposedly so convinced of Formosus's disloyalty that he made him promise never to return to Rome or even speak to the Pope again, under threat of damnation. And Formosus, being a good political player, agreed, a kind of celestial restraining order, if you will. The fact that this agreement was later nullified just goes to show you how little these oaths meant when the right political winds were blowing. The very ground you stand on feels like quicksand. You can never be sure what's real, what's a threat, or who's on your side. You're just a pawn in this grand messy game, and the next move might be the one that gets you taken off the board. You can feel the tension in the air, a low hum of unease that never really goes away. It's the kind of place where you make an enemy and they don't just badmouth you. They poison your wine or hire an assassin to follow you through the labyrinthine streets. And the church, the supposed bastion of peace and divine grace, is right in the thick of it all. It's a beautiful place if you can ignore the constant risk of sudden death, which is, to be fair, quite a bit to ignore. It's like admiring the beautiful architecture of a building while it's on fire. A lot of pretty details, but the core experience is one of pure, unadulterated danger. And this is the world that Formosus, the man who would be Pope, had to navigate every single day of his life. A world where the holy could so easily become unholy, and where a person's life and legacy could be undone not just by politics, but by the ultimate form of papal displeasure. You're now in the late summer of the year 891 AD, and the papacy has finally found a moment of relative calm. Formosus, our political chameleon from the last section, has, against all odds, been elected Pope. You stand in the sun-drenched courtyard of the Lateran Palace, the seat of papal power, and a sense of fragile stability seems to have settled over Rome. Formosus, now Pope, is a man in his late 70s, a venerable figure with a reputation for piety and a surprisingly sharp political mind. He's spent his papacy trying to mend fences, to unite the squabbling Roman factions under the banner of the Church. He crowned the new Holy Roman Emperor, a man named Lambert of Spoleto, in a move meant to solidify an alliance with a powerful regional family. It's a delicate balancing act, like trying to get two toddlers to share a single toy without a meltdown. The alliance is meant to be a cornerstone of his papacy, a peace treaty etched in gold and sealed with a holy blessing. Mainstream historical fact for you: Formosus made a very deliberate political choice to crown Lambert as emperor. This was a move aimed at placating the powerful Spoletan family, a faction with which Formosus had a long and complicated history. It was a classic keep your friends close and your enemies closer strategy, and for a few years it seemed to work. But the peace was always a shallow thing, a thin veneer of calm over a boiling pot of resentment. The Spoletan family, led by Lambert's mother, the formidable Empress Egeltrude, never truly trusted Formosus. To them, he was still the man who had opposed their interests in the past, a rival whose ambition they could never quite forget. Think of it like a business merger where the two CEOs pretend to get along at the press conference, but you know they're plotting each other's downfall behind the scenes. This undercurrent of suspicion and barely contained animosity is the air you breathe. You can almost taste the bitterness. Then, just as the air seems to be clearing, the delicate peace shatters. In the spring of 896, Pope Formosus dies. It happens suddenly, unexpectedly. One day he is there, a wise old man on the papal throne, and the next he is gone. The official cause is listed as old age, and for a man of his years that's not an unreasonable assumption. But in a city where every death of a powerful man is whispered to be something more sinister, you can't help but wonder. Was it a natural passing, or was it the political game finally catching up to him? A subtle poison slipped into his wine, a gentle push down a flight of stairs. The lack of official investigation into the matter is, in itself, telling. The power vacuum is immediate, a sudden, violent inhalation of breath before the scramble begins. Now for a quirky tidbit. After Formosus's death, the papacy was held by Boniface VI, a man whose tenure was so short and so ignoble that he was later officially struck from the list of popes. He was in office for just 15 days before he died. Some sources claim he was poisoned. It's like the papal throne itself was cursed, a seat that just couldn't hold a living occupant for more than a few days at a time. This rapid succession of short-lived popes is a testament to the chaotic, cutthroat nature of Roman politics at the time. It was a game with very high stakes and a very fast turnover rate, and the only rule seemed to be that there were no rules. You see the chaos unfold before you. The Roman factions, who had been holding their breath under Formosus's fragile peace, now begin to exhale in a gust of renewed rivalry. The Spoleto faction, led by the vengeful Egeltrude, seized their opportunity. They had never forgiven Formosus for his past opposition, and his death is not seen as a resolution, but as an invitation. An invitation for payback. You can feel the city's mood shift. The polite veneer of a few weeks ago has been torn away, revealing the raw, ugly ambition beneath. The families are mobilizing, their private armies gathering in the shadows of the ancient ruins. Historians still argue whether Pope Stephen VI, the man who would take centre stage in this drama, was already a pawn in the Spoletan family's game before Formosus's death, or if he was simply an ambitious cleric who saw his chance and seized it. Was he a collaborator, a prearranged instrument of revenge, or an opportunist who was simply in the right place at the right time? The historical record is muddy, as if the people writing it were trying to cover their own tracks. The sources offer conflicting accounts, some painting him as a loyal Spleeto ally from the start, others as a newly converted partisan. It's like trying to figure out if your friend's new boyfriend is a long-term partner or just a fleeting fling based on their Instagram posts. You see a few pictures, a few hints, but the full story remains just out of reach. For Moses' death is not just the end of a long life, it's the beginning of something truly strange and dark. It's the event that triggers the next, utterly bizarre chapter of this story. You're standing in the very heart of the Roman political machine, a city where the dead can't even rest in peace. The legacy of Formosus, a man who thought he had secured his position and his papacy, is about to be dragged through the mud, a fate far worse than death. The city holds its breath, waiting to see what new outrage the Spoletan family and their chosen pawn will unleash upon the memory of their departed foe. And you, a silent observer in the shadows, can feel the chill of what is to come. The calm is over, the storm is brewing, the political whirlwind of Rome has spun itself into a new reality. The short-lived papacy of Boniface VI, a mere 15-day interregnum, is over. He's gone, and his time on the papal throne is so brief and so unsavoury that the Church would later try to pretend it never happened. This political vacuum, the sheer instability of the moment, has created the perfect opportunity for the ambitious and the vengeful. You watch as a new figure emerges from the chaos, Stephen, the Bishop of Anagni. He is a man of the cloth, sure, but he is first and foremost a man of the Spoletan faction. He is their champion, their chosen instrument of revenge against the ghost of Pope Formosus. He's not a quiet, pious man, he is a zealous partisan, brimming with a deep-seated animosity that feels almost personal. Mainstream historical fact for you. Stephen VI was a firm ally of the powerful Spoletan family. He was a protégé of their leader, Empress Agiltrude, a woman who wielded more power than most men of her time. His rise to the papacy was not a matter of divine election, as much as it was a calculated political manoeuvre. His election was pushed through by the Spoletan faction and their armed supporters, a clear message to their rivals that they were back in control. The old Roman nobility, the one Formosus had tried to appease, found themselves pushed aside, their influence waning in the face of this new, aggressive force. You can feel the tension in the air as Stephen VI takes the papal throne. The chants of the faithful are mixed with the hushed, nervous whispers of the Roman citizens. The air feels heavy, like before a thunderstorm. The new pope's face is not one of serene piety, but of grim determination. He is not here to mend fences or to find common ground. He is here to settle a score. His election marks a clear and deliberate repudiation of everything Pope Formosus had tried to achieve. The peace treaty with Lambert of Spoleto? Now it seems like a useless scrap of parchment. The alliances Formosus had built, they are crumbling to dust. And here's a quirky tidbit. Before becoming pope, Stephen VI was the Bishop of Anagni, a city with a rich and sometimes rebellious history. Anagni was known for being a hotbed of political intrigue, and a frequent home to popes who were either seeking refuge or consolidating their power. This background might have shaped Stephen's worldview, hardening him against his political opponents and teaching him that power was not given, but taken. He wasn't a naive idealist, he was a pragmatist forged in the fires of regional Roman politics. Historians still argue whether Stephen VI's hatred for Formosus was purely political, or if there was a personal component as well. Some sources suggest Stephen was genuinely convinced Formosus was a usurper and a heretic, a man who had illegally occupied the See of Peter. Others believe his animosity was simply a reflection of the Spoletan family's desire to erase Formosus's legacy and consolidate their own power. Was he a true believer in his cause, or just a puppet on Agiltrude's string? The evidence is contradictory. Maybe it was both. A person can hate someone for political reasons and genuinely believe their own righteous indignation is a matter of divine justice. You watch him move through the Lateran Palace, and you can almost see the gears turning in his head. He's not just thinking about the next papal decree. He is plotting. He is planning. He is preparing to do something that will shock the entire Christian world. The first hint of his intention comes in the form of a change in tone. The papal court, once a place of cautious diplomacy, now feels like a war room. Formosus is no longer just a deceased predecessor. He is a villain, a usurper, a scoundrel. Stephen VI and his allies begin to circulate stories and accusations. They dredge up the old charges of disloyalty and plotting that Formosus had faced years ago. They claim his papacy was illegitimate from the start, a sacrilege against the church. It's a classic case of historical revisionism, a deliberate attempt to poison the well of public memory. Remember the serene, elderly pope from the last section? Well, in this version of the story, he's a villain in disguise, a wolf in sheep's clothing. You can see the public reaction beginning to form. Some are sceptical, but many are swayed by the sheer force of Stephen VI's conviction. In this world without mass media, the man with the loudest, most confident voice often wins the day, and Stephen's voice is thunderous. He speaks with the moral authority of the papacy, which even in this chaotic period still carries immense weight with the people. He is not just a politician, he is the spiritual leader of the West, and his words are meant to be taken as divine truth. The atmosphere becomes increasingly hostile toward the memory of Formosus. The city is being primed for what is to come. The groundwork is being laid for a spectacle of unprecedented horror. You can almost feel the collective dread. People whisper in alleyways and in the back of churches, "What is Stephen going to do? He can't just let Formosus's reputation rot in the grave. He needs to do something theatrical, something final, something so outrageous that it will send a message to everyone, living and dead, that his papacy is the only true one. He needs to do something that will erase Formosus's legacy from the pages of history forever. And you, a helpless observer, feel the sense of dread deepen. You know that whatever he is planning, it will be something beyond the pale, an act so monstrous it will be remembered for 1,000 years. And it all begins with this man, Stephen VI, and his burning, unrelenting desire for revenge. The political machinations have reached a fever pitch. Pope Stephen VI, with the full backing of the powerful Spoletan family and their formidable Empress Aeseltrude, has consolidated his power. The quiet whispers have turned into loud accusations. The stage is set, and the star of this grotesque show has a chilling plan. You stand in the heart of Rome, a city once so full of life and light, now bathed in the shadow of a truly bizarre and disturbing decree. Mainstream historical fact for you: in late January of the year 897, Pope Stephen VI issued a decree so shocking and unprecedented that it would be remembered for centuries. He ordered the body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, to be exhumed from its tomb in St. Peter's Basilica. Formosus had been dead for 9 months, and the Pope's order was met with a mix of terror and incredulity. It was a clear violation of both canon law and simple human decency. The decree was not just about settling a political score. It was about the complete and utter humiliation of a dead man. It was a message to all of Formosus's remaining allies that no one was safe, not even in death. You hear the news spread like a virus through the city. The papal guards, a unit more akin to a private army, are dispatched to St. Peter's. The common people watch in a mixture of horrified fascination and disbelief. Has the new pope gone mad? What possible purpose could there be in digging up a dead man? The act itself is a violation of the sanctity of burial, a fundamental tenet of Christian faith. The fear is palpable. If the new pope is willing to do this to a former pontiff, what is he capable of doing to a simple citizen? The air grows thick with a sense of dread. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. The formal charge Stephen VI levelled against Formosus was that he had transgressed a law which forbade bishops from being translated or moved from one episcopal see to another. Formosus had been the bishop of the See of Porto before he was elected pope. The logic was that since a pope is first and foremost the bishop of Rome, Formosus had violated this ancient law, making his papacy illegitimate. It's a bit like saying a new CEO can be fired for having worked at a different company before. Even though that's the whole point of a career, it's a flimsy pretext, a legalistic smokescreen for an act of pure vengeance. The fact that the rule about translation was so obscure and had been violated by other popes, including Stephen himself, only highlights the hypocrisy of the charge. You watch as the crowds begin to gather. It's a macabre scene, a strange combination of a morbid curiosity and a deep sense of unease. The city of Rome, which has seen its share of bizarre events, is about to witness something truly unique. The command from Stephen VI goes far beyond just exhumation. He has declared that the body of Pope Formosus, a man who had been dead and buried for 9 months, would be put on trial. A full-blown legal proceeding with a prosecutor, a judge, and the corpse itself as the accused. This isn't just an act of vengeance, it's a dark theatrical performance, a morbid show trial designed to send a powerful message. Historians still argue whether Stephen VI was acting out of a genuine, if twisted, belief that he was doing God's work, or if he was simply a power-hungry puppet of the Spoletan faction. Was he a true fanatic convinced that Formosus was a heretic who had defiled the Holy See? Or was this just a spectacularly public way of cementing his own power by erasing the legacy of his predecessor? The sources from the period, mostly written by later chroniclers, are deeply conflicted. Some portray him as a villain of unparalleled cruelty, others as a misguided zealot. It's like trying to determine the true motive behind a high-profile political scandal with nothing but the tabloids to go on. Was it for power, or was it a matter of principle, however warped? Maybe it was a little of both. The Cadaver Synod, as this trial would come to be known, was a political masterstroke in its own twisted way. By putting a corpse on trial and finding it guilty, Stephen VI could retroactively declare all of Formosus's acts invalid. This meant that all the bishops, priests and deacons Formosus had ordained were now considered to have invalid orders. It was a clever, if monstrous, way of dismantling his predecessor's power base and creating a loyal new one. It was a cleansing fire meant to burn away all traces of his enemy's influence. You can almost hear the gears turning in Stephen's head. He's not just seeking revenge, he's creating a new reality. He's saying, the past is a lie. Everything that came before me was a mistake, and I am here to correct it. It's an act of supreme arrogance, a man trying to play God by rewriting history with a pickaxe and a papal decree. And you, a helpless witness to this unfolding madness, can only watch as the papal guards march towards St. Peter's Basilica, their grim faces illuminated by the flickering torches. They are not just on a mission to dig up a body. They are on a mission to dig up the past, to put a dead man in the dock, and to desecrate his memory in the most public and grotesque way imaginable. The air feels cold, heavy with the promise of something truly awful. The scene is set, the decree has been issued, and now the unsavoury task begins. You stand in the hallowed grounds of St. Peter's Basilica, a place that should be a sanctuary of peace, now a stage for a macabre act. It's early in the year 897, and the air is cold and damp. The papal guards, grim-faced and silent, gather around a spot near the altar. They have the papal seal on their uniforms, a chilling reminder that this unholy task is being carried out under the highest authority in the land. The grave is marked, and the gravediggers, their shovels glinting in the faint light of the torches, begin their work, the sound of earth being disturbed, of wood scraping against wood, fills the sacred space, a jarring counterpoint to the silent, ghostly awe that usually inhabits a place of such reverence. Mainstream historical fact for you. Pope Formosus's body was exhumed 9 months after his death. This meant that the decomposition process was well underway, and the body would have been in a state of decay. The scene was, by all accounts, deeply disturbing and foul-smelling. The gravediggers had to work quickly, pulling the body from its resting place and preparing it for transport. It was a clear violation of Christian burial practices, which emphasised the sanctity of the body and the need for it to rest in peace until the final judgment. The act itself was a spectacle of defiance against these very traditions. You watch as the body is pulled from the tomb. It's a grotesque parody of a religious procession. The corpse, dressed in the tattered remnants of its papal robes, is hauled from the grave and propped up in a makeshift chair. The once pious hands are now limp and lifeless, the face a shrunken, decaying mask. The smell is overpowering, a stench that even the cold winter air can't fully dissipate. It's a sensory assault, a grim reminder of the finality of death and the disgusting reality of what Stephen VI has ordered. This is no dignified trial. It's a carnival of the morbid, a display of utter contempt for the dead. The sight of the body, a vessel that once held the soul of a powerful man, now reduced to this, is profoundly unsettling. And here's a quirky tidbit. The cadaver of Pope Formosus was said to have been dressed in full papal regalia, a kind of dark comedy meant to mimic the dignity of a living pope. The regalia would have included the pallium, a woolen vestment given to archbishops by the pope, and a few other key symbols of his office. This was a deliberate act, a way to make the mockery complete. It was a theatrical flourish, a visual cue to the onlookers that this wasn't just a simple body. This was the accused, and he was being brought to justice in a perverted mockery of a formal procession. Historians still argue whether the crowd of Roman citizens and clergy who witnessed this was a hostile, vengeful mob or a group of horrified and silent onlookers. Some accounts describe a crowd that cheered and jeered, a public hungry for the spectacle. Other sources paint a picture of quiet, stunned horror, a people so shocked by the sacrilege that they couldn't speak. The truth, as it so often is probably somewhere in the middle. You can imagine a mix of genuine believers in Stephen's cause, a few bored spectators just there for the show, and a larger group of people simply too afraid to voice their dissent. It's a social experiment in cruelty, a real-time lesson in how quickly public opinion can be swayed by fear and spectacle. The body, now propped up, is paraded through the streets to the Lateran Palace, a journey that should have been a peaceful reburial and is now a triumph of the macabre. The procession is led by Stephen VI and his entourage, and you can see a look of grim satisfaction on the new pope's face. To him, this isn't just about putting a body on trial, it's about making a point, about cleansing the papacy of what he sees as a stain. The journey to the Lateran is a final act of humiliation for Formosus, a spectacle designed to grind his memory into the dust. You trudge alongside the procession, a ghost in a crowd of the living, and you feel a deep sense of revulsion. This is not justice. This is not even revenge. This is something far darker and more twisted. The procession reaches its destination, the Lateran Basilica. The body of the former pope, still dressed in its decaying robes, is taken inside. The stage is set. The jury is ready, the prosecutor is prepared, and the accused, a silent, putrefying lump of a man, is ready to be judged. The very walls of the basilica seem to tremble with the unholy energy of the moment. The air, already thick with the smell of death, grows heavy with the anticipation of what is to come. It's a surreal and deeply disturbing moment, a perfect storm of political ambition, religious fanaticism, and sheer unadulterated madness. The Cadaver Synod is about to begin. You can almost hear the low, rumbling hum of the crowd as they wait to see what new depths of depravity will be plumbed in the name of God and political power. You are now inside the Lateran Basilica, the heart of the Roman Church and the seat of papal power. The Great Hall, usually a place of quiet contemplation and pious ritual, has been transformed into a bizarre and grotesque courtroom. The air, heavy with the scent of death from the corpse of Formosus, is thick with a different kind of tension, the electric charge of a spectacle. You stand among the crowd, a silent witness to a scene that seems more fitting for a grim medieval play than for a sacred institution. The Cadaver Synod is officially underway. Mainstream historical fact for you: Pope Stephen VI presides over the trial in person, seated on the papal throne. His face is a mask of grim determination. He's surrounded by the highest-ranking members of the Roman clergy, bishops and cardinals who have either been coerced into attendance or are willing participants in this dark farce. The congregation is a mix of Roman nobles, curious onlookers, and members of the clergy, all watching with a combination of horrified fascination and silent dread. The very presence of the Pope as both a prosecutor and a judge is a clear signal that this is not a fair trial, but a show trial. The outcome has been decided before a single word is uttered, and in the centre of it all is the accused. The cadaver of Pope Formosus, clad in his decaying papal robes, is propped up on a throne, his shrunken form a macabre echo of the living man he once was. The scene is so absurd it's almost comical, but the gravity of the moment, the sheer sacrilege of it all, erases any trace of humour. The body is a silent, grotesque figure, a prop in a performance of vengeance. His eyes, though long since turned to dust, seem to stare out into the crowd, a chilling and passive observer of his own degradation. A quirky tidbit for you. Because the accused could not possibly speak for himself, Pope Stephen VI had a young deacon appointed to represent Formosus. This deacon was forced to stand behind the decaying body, answering for him with a terrified and quavering voice. You can only imagine the fear and humiliation of this young man, caught between the living Pope's rage and the dead Pope's silence. He is a proxy, a mouthpiece for a man who is no more, and his very presence highlights the profound absurdity of the entire proceeding. It's like a corporate lawyer being forced to represent a potted plant in a lawsuit. The act is pointless, and the person being forced to do it knows it. Historians still argue whether the participants in the Cadaver Synod truly believed in the legitimacy of the trial, or if they were simply afraid to defy the will of Pope Stephen VI and his powerful allies, the Spoletan faction. Were they truly convinced of Formosus's guilt, or were they just going along with the madness to save their own skins? The historical sources are divided. Some suggest that the trial was a genuine, albeit deeply misguided, attempt to right a perceived wrong. Others argue it was a blatant abuse of power, a public relations stunt designed to solidify Stephen's papacy and erase the memory of his predecessor. The sheer terror in the young deacon's eyes, however, suggests that at least some of the people in that room were well aware of the farce and were just trying to survive it. It's an exercise in power and fear, a very public way of showing who is in charge and what happens to those who get on the wrong side of the new regime. The Lateran Basilica, a place of spiritual authority and solemn tradition, feels like it has been defiled. Every prayer, every chant, every whispered word seems to carry the weight of this unholy event. The frescoes on the wall, the statues of saints, the very air itself seems to recoil from the scene. The sight of the corpse on the throne, with the young deacon cowering behind it, is a stark visual representation of the breakdown of order and sanity. Stephen VI's face is a study in intense fanatical conviction. He is not a man pretending. He seems to genuinely believe that he is righting a cosmic wrong. To him, Formosus's papacy was an affront to God, and this trial is a form of divine justice. He believes that by putting a dead man on trial, he is not just settling a political score but purifying the church itself. This twisted sense of righteousness is perhaps the most frightening thing of all. It's one thing for a villain to act out of pure malice, but it's another for them to believe they are a hero. The trial is poised to begin. The solemnity of the occasion is a mockery, a thin veil over the raw, ugly reality of political vengeance. The Lateran, a symbol of Christian unity, has become a stage for a grotesque drama of division and hate. You can feel the collective breath being held in the room, the silent anticipation of what is to come, and in the middle of it all a dead man sits on a throne, a passive victim in a trial that he can neither win nor lose. His fate has already been decided. The verdict has been written in the stars long ago. The Cadaver Synod is not a search for truth, it is an exercise in power, and you, a quiet observer, feel the chill of the moment settle in your bones. The show is about to begin. The Cadaver Synod is in full swing. You stand in the crowd, a silent observer of a scene that defies all logic and sanity. Pope Stephen VI, his face a mask of furious conviction, stares down at the decaying body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus. The young deacon, visibly shaking, stands behind the corpse, a terrified mouthpiece for a man who cannot speak. The air is thick with the stench of decay and the palpable tension of a rigged trial. Mainstream historical fact for you: the prosecution was led by Stephen VI himself, who acted as both prosecutor and judge. He levelled a series of charges against the deceased Formosus, most of them flimsy and pretextual. The primary charge was that Formosus had unlawfully translated, or moved from one episcopal see to another, a violation of an obscure and often ignored canon law. Stephen also accused him of perjury and of aspiring to the papal throne in an illegal and unholy way. This was a direct violation of every known legal principle. The accused was not only dead, but was being tried by his most vengeful enemy, with no real defence to speak of. It was a one-sided diatribe, a monologue of hatred disguised as a legal proceeding. You can almost hear Stephen's voice, a furious booming sound that echoes through the basilica. He rants and raves, his accusations growing more and more unhinged. He points a finger at the silent cadaver as if expecting it to cower or confess. Why did you, in your ambition, usurp the universal Roman See in such a spirit of hostility? He shouts. Why did you, in your audacity, transgress the sacred canons? His words are not those of a pious man seeking justice, but of a man consumed by a burning personal vendetta. He is not just trying to prove Formosus guilty, he is trying to erase him from the history books. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. At one point during the trial, Stephen VI, in a bizarre and truly theatrical display, would turn to the trembling deacon and demand, "Do you have anything to say in your defence?" The deacon, a terrified proxy for the dead pope, was forced to stammer out a few inaudible words, a pathetic and futile attempt at a defence that only highlighted the sheer absurdity of the entire proceeding. It's like a stand-up comedian asking a brick wall if it has an objection. The question itself is part of the joke, But in this case, the joke is a grim and horrifying one. The deacon's forced participation was not just a formality. It was a psychological torture, a way of forcing someone else to participate in this unholy act. Historians still argue whether Stephen VI's behaviour was a result of a genuine, fanatical belief in the heresy of Formosus, or if he was simply a deeply disturbed individual who had lost touch with reality. Some sources suggest he was a megalomaniac, drunk on power and convinced of his own righteousness. Others paint him as a puppet of the Spoletan family, acting out their long-simmering revenge. It's like trying to determine if a public figure is a true believer in a fringe conspiracy theory, or just using it as a convenient cover for their own power grab. The sources are contradictory, but his actions speak for themselves. The spectacle was so over the top, so devoid of legal or spiritual merit, that it suggests a man who was either unhinged or so deeply convinced of his own rightness that he could not see the madness of his actions. The trial continues for what feels like an eternity. The charges are read, the accusations are made, and the silent, rotting body of Formosus sits there, a silent testament to the ultimate indignity. The air is so thick with the stench of death and the weight of Stephen's fury that it feels hard to breathe. The crowd, a silent and morbid jury, watches with a mixture of fear and fascination. They are witnessing a legal proceeding that has no precedent, a show trial that will be remembered for its sheer depravity. Stephen VI's final act of prosecution is to declare that Formosus had violated the very sacred office he once held. He asserts that a man who had been a bishop of one see could not also be a bishop of another, and that his election as pope, who is first and foremost the Bishop of Rome, was therefore illegal and invalid. It's a ridiculous charge, a legalistic sleight of hand to justify an act of monstrous revenge. It's a bit like a judge convicting a man of murder, because his car was parked in a no-parking zone. The logic is so twisted, so nonsensical, that it can only be explained by the sheer, unadulterated hatred that drives the man making the accusation. And you, a helpless ghost in the room, can only watch. You see the fanaticism in Stephen's eyes, the fear in the deacon's face, and the silent horror in the crowd. This is not justice. This is not a trial. This is a public lynching, a gruesome pantomime designed to humiliate the dead and terrify the living. The verdict, has been decided before the first word was ever spoken. Formosus is guilty. The only question that remains is what horrific punishment Stephen VI will unleash on the cadaver and its memory. The mock prosecution is over, and the final dark chapter of this bizarre trial is about to begin. The air in the Lateran Basilica is now so thick with the stench of decay and the weight of Stephen VI's fury that it feels like a physical presence. The mock prosecution is over, and the time for the charges to be formally presented has arrived. You watch, silent and horrified, as Pope Stephen VI stands before the silent, decaying body of Pope Formosus and prepares to lay out the full, absurd scope of his case. This isn't just a political hit job, it's a theological one, a twisted attempt to use the very tenets of the faith as a weapon. Mainstream historical fact for you. The central charge of heresy brought against Formosus was based on the accusation that he had violated an ancient canon law that prohibited a bishop from leaving his original see to preside over another. Because the Pope is, by definition, the Bishop of Rome, Stephen VI argued that Formosus, having been the Bishop of Porto before his election, had committed a profound and unholy transgression. This was a classic case of selective outrage, as this law had been ignored or circumvented by numerous popes and bishops for centuries, including Stephen VI himself, who had been a bishop of Anagni before he took the papal throne. The very premise of the charge was a flimsy and hypocritical pretext for a predetermined act of revenge. You can almost hear the cold, venomous logic as Stephen VI lays it out. He paints a picture of Formosus as a religious criminal, a man who had not just broken a rule, but had desecrated the very office of the papacy. He claims that Formosus's election was invalid from the start, a sacrilege against the church. This wasn't just about the translation of a bishop, but about the very legitimacy of his papacy, and, by extension, every single act he had performed as pope. Stephen VI's legal argument was a kind of spiritual domino effect. If Formosus was guilty of this one heresy, then everything he did while in office was null and void. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. The Cadaver Synod's official legal name was the Synodus Horrenda, the horrifying synod. The name was so fitting that it stuck, a testament to the fact that even at the time, People were aware that this was not a normal legal proceeding, but a monstrous act of public desecration. The title alone tells you everything you need to know about how the event was perceived by those who weren't directly involved in the conspiracy. It wasn't a holy moment of justice. It was an act of horror, a stain on the history of the church. Historians still argue about the true motivations of the clergy who participated in this trial. Were they genuinely convinced by Stephen VI's bizarre legal and theological arguments, or were they simply too afraid to oppose him? The Spoletan family, with their armed guards and political muscle, was a powerful force in Rome. It is highly probable that many of the bishops and cardinals present were there under duress, their silent complicity a sign of their terror rather than their agreement. The fear of being a future corpse on trial would have been a very effective motivator for silence. The atmosphere was one of silent terror and complicity, not one of righteous zeal. The accusations against Formosus went beyond just the charge of translation. Stephen VI, in his furious and unhinged diatribe, also accused him of perjury and of having illegally aspired to the papacy. He claimed Formosus had broken an oath he had made to Pope John VIII years earlier, which forbade him from returning to Rome. It was a clear case of dredging up old grievances and twisting them into new horrifying charges. The legalistic arguments were thin, but the passion behind them was real and frightening. The sheer, unadulterated hatred that fueled Stephen VI was the true driving force of the trial. The absurdity of the moment is staggering. A live man, breathing and full of righteous rage, is yelling at a dead man, accusing him of a crime that no one else in the room could have been punished for. The cadaver of Formosus is a silent, grotesque figure, a passive recipient of all this hatred. He cannot speak, he cannot defend himself, he cannot even look away. He is the ultimate victim, a physical embodiment of the injustice being perpetrated, and the rest of the clergy, the cardinals and bishops, sit there and watch. Their face is a mixture of fear, shame, and a sick, morbid curiosity. The Cadaver Synod was a turning point, not just in this bizarre story, but in the history of the papacy itself. It showed how far a pope could go, how much he could get away with, and how easily the sacred could be corrupted by the profane. It was a dark, chilling moment that would forever be a black mark on the Church's history. The charge of heresy was more than just a legal argument. It was an attempt to erase a man's entire life and legacy, to unmake a pope and invalidate all his work. And you, a helpless observer, watch as Stephen VI pronounces his final judgment, his voice echoing in the unholy silence of the basilica, the verdict already a foregone conclusion. The show is nearly over, but the desecration has only just begun. The punishment for the dead pope is about to be revealed, and it is far more terrible than any of the living in that room could have imagined. The sham trial has reached its terrible conclusion. Pope Stephen VI, his face flushed with triumph, sits on the papal throne, a grim parody of a just and impartial judge. You can feel the collective breath being held in the basilica, the air thick with a sense of morbid anticipation. The mock prosecution is over, the charges of heresy and sacrilege have been levelled, and now the verdict, long since determined, is about to be pronounced. The cadaver of Pope Formosus, propped up in its chair, is a silent, grotesque figure of passive judgment. Mainstream historical fact for you, Pope Stephen VI, acting as both prosecutor and judge, pronounced the verdict himself. There was no deliberation, no jury, and no semblance of a fair trial. The verdict was a simple, brutal declaration. Pope Formosus was found guilty on all charges. This act, which had no precedent in the history of the Church, was meant to completely invalidate Formosus's papacy and all of his official acts. It was an act of complete and utter political and spiritual annihilation. The Cadaver Synod was not a legal proceeding, it was a ritual of humiliation, a grotesque public spectacle meant to send a chilling message to anyone who dared to oppose the Spoletan faction. You hear the words of the verdict echoing through the silent basilica, a booming declaration of a judgment that had been decided months ago. Stephen VI, with a furious and self-righteous voice, declares Formosus a heretic, a usurper, and a man who had defiled the Holy See. He condemns his papacy as illegitimate, and all of his ordinations as invalid. It's a retroactive undoing of history, a paper-thin attempt to erase a man's legacy with a single furious decree. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. The sentence that Stephen VI pronounced upon the corpse of Formosus was not just a legal one. It was a series of punishments that were both symbolic and physically grotesque. The cadaver was to be stripped of all its papal vestments, and the 3 fingers of its right hand, the very fingers used to give blessings, were to be cut off. This act was a chillingly specific form of desecration, a symbolic castration of Formosus's spiritual authority. It was a vicious act, designed to mock and humiliate the dead man in the most visceral way possible. Historians still argue whether the entire affair was a personal vendetta of Stephen VI's, or if he was simply acting as a pawn for the powerful Empress Ageltrude and her Spoletan family. Was the hatred that drove this monstrous act a personal one, a deep-seated animosity that Stephen had carried with him for years, or was it a political calculation, a way to cement his own power and dismantle the alliances of his predecessor? The sources are contradictory, but the sheer cruelty of the punishment suggests a level of hatred that goes far beyond simple political expediency. It was a crime of passion, albeit a cold, calculated one. The moment of the sentencing is a study in horror. You see Stephen VI descend from his throne, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He approaches the corpse, and with a small knife, he begins the horrific process of mutilation. The sight of a pope, a spiritual leader, desecrating the body of his predecessor is a chilling and unforgettable image. The sound of the cutting, the sight of the fingers being severed from the lifeless hand, is too much for many in the crowd. They turn away, their faces a mixture of disgust and terror. The young deacon, who had been forced to speak for the dead man, collapses in a horrified heap. The 3 fingers, the very ones used to make the sign of the cross and to give papal blessings, are severed from the cadaver. It's an act of supreme spiritual and physical violation, a public declaration that Formosus's blessings were empty, his authority void, and his very existence a lie. The fingers are tossed onto the floor, a gruesome trophy of Stephen VI's victory. They are a visible testament to the violence and hatred that has consumed the Roman Church. The Cadaver Synod has reached its crescendo of depravity. The verdict and sentencing are more than just the end of a trial. They are the beginning of a new, horrifying chapter. The cadaver, now officially a convicted heretic, is to be disposed of in the most humiliating way possible. Stephen VI and his allies have decided that the body, once buried in the hallowed ground of St. Peter's Basilica, is no longer worthy of a Christian burial. It must be cast out, rejected by both God and man. The stage has been set for the final gruesome act of this dark drama, and you, a silent observer of this historical horror show, can feel the revulsion and shame radiating from the crowd. The Roman people have witnessed something they will never be able to forget, a public display of cruelty that will forever be a stain on the history of the papacy. The Cadaver Synod is over, but the desecration is far from done. The final terrible punishments are about to be inflicted, and the consequences will be far-reaching and bloody. The sentence has been pronounced, and the Roman Church has just crossed a line from which it might never return. The verdict is in, the sentence is pronounced, and now the grotesque spectacle of punishment begins. You stand in the Lateran Basilica, your stomach turning as you watch the final acts of desecration unfold. Pope Stephen VI, his face a mask of furious righteousness, has passed judgment on a man who cannot defend himself, and now he is ensuring the punishment is as public and as humiliating as possible. This is not just about a dead man, it's about a living message, a violent, chilling display of power that is meant to terrify the living. Mainstream historical fact for you. After the formal sentencing, the cadaver of Pope Formosus was stripped of its papal vestments. These symbols of his office, the pallium, the mitre, the papal ring, were all torn from the body and thrown away. This was not a symbolic act of stripping away spiritual authority. It was a physical act of public humiliation. The body, now dressed in only its rotting burial shroud, was a gruesome sight. A stark and brutal symbol of a pope who was no longer a pope, a spiritual leader who had been rendered spiritually naked. The desecration was not just about the body. It was about the idea of the man, the very concept of his legacy. It was an attempt to erase him from the collective memory. You can hear the sounds of the stripping, the tearing of the old fabric, the clinking of the papal ring as it is thrown to the stone floor. It's a jarring, terrible sound in a place of such solemnity. The clergy present, the same men who had sat in silent complicity during the trial, now watch in a state of horrified awe. They are witnessing an act of pure sacrilege, a violation of everything they hold sacred, and yet they are powerless to stop it. The atmosphere in the basilica has shifted from one of morbid curiosity to one of pure terror. They know that if this can happen to a pope, it can happen to anyone. And here's a quirky tidbit. The 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand, which had been used for papal blessings, were not just cut off. They were deliberately, and according to some sources, ritually removed and thrown into the Tiber River. This was not an act of simple mutilation. It was a symbolic rejection of his spiritual authority. The hand that had blessed, that had ordained, that had confirmed, those fingers were now cast into a river, a final, definitive act of contempt. It was a bizarre kind of holy vandalism, a dark, perverted ritual that only added to the terrifying absurdity of the entire event. It's like breaking a politician's trophy and then throwing it in a lake. It's not just a sign of disrespect, it's a statement of permanent, unholy contempt. Historians still argue whether Pope Stephen VI's motivation was purely political, or if it was rooted in a genuine, if twisted, theological belief. Some scholars believe that he saw Formosus as a religious usurper, a man who had polluted the Holy See and whose very acts were therefore spiritually invalid. To them, the Cadaver Synod was a necessary act of spiritual cleansing, a kind of ecclesiastical purification ritual. Others see it as nothing more than a political power play, an attempt by the Spoletan faction to dismantle the power base of their rivals. Was he a true fanatic or a cold, calculating politician? The truth, as is so often the case, probably lies somewhere in the middle, a messy intersection of personal hatred, political ambition, and a perverted sense of religious righteousness. The cadaver, now stripped and mutilated, is no longer a pope. It's not even a man. It's a piece of political garbage, a lump of decaying flesh that has been declared unholy and unpope-like. The silence in the basilica is no longer a silent awe. It is a horrified stillness. The crowd, the clergy, and even the guards stand in mute shock as Stephen VI pronounces the final terrible sentence. He declares that the body of the heretic Formosus is not worthy of a Christian burial. He orders that it be taken from the basilica and thrown into the Tiber River, a final, unholy act of desecration. You watch as the body, now a mere object of revulsion, is dragged from the basilica and through the streets of Rome. The procession is a mockery of a funeral, a final ignominious parade of a man who had once been the most powerful spiritual leader in the world. The Roman people, who had watched the cadaver enter in a grotesque parody of a procession, now watch it being dragged through the streets like a piece of refuse. The air is filled not with solemnity or grief, but with a mixture of shock and disgust. The Cadaver Synod was a spectacle of violence, a horrifying act of papal vandalism that would forever be a black mark on the history of the Church. The aftermath of the trial was a chilling reminder that in this brutal, lawless world, even death offered no escape from the relentless consuming fires of political hatred. The cadaver of Formosus, once a symbol of the Church, was now a symbol of its deepest and most violent contradictions. It had been stripped, mutilated and desecrated, a physical manifestation of a spiritual and political war that had finally reached its terrible conclusion. The river, is the final destination, but the river is not a tomb. It's a place of final, utter humiliation. The story, however, is far from over. This act of sacrilege will have consequences, and they will be swift and terrible. The grotesque procession is finally at an end. You have followed the silent, horrified crowd as they watch the cadaver of Pope Formosus drag through the streets of Rome, a final, public act of humiliation. The journey is a grim parody of a funeral cortege, a testament to the unholy power that Pope Stephen VI has consolidated. The path leads to the Tiber River, the ancient lifeblood of the city, which is now to be a watery tomb for a man who once held the most sacred office in the Christian world. The air is cold, and a fine mist hangs over the water, adding to the surreal, dreamlike horror of the scene. Mainstream historical fact for you: the cadaver of Pope Formosus, now stripped of its papal vestments and with the fingers of its blessing hand severed, was unceremoniously thrown into the Tiber River. This was not a quick, merciful act. The body was thrown into the river, a final, definitive act of contempt and desecration. According to historical accounts, the body was tied with stones or weights to ensure that it would sink to the bottom. This was a clear message from Pope Stephen VI and the Spoletan faction. The memory and legacy of Formosus were to be permanently erased, his body cast out from the land of the living, and the possibility of a dignified burial. You watch as the guards, their faces grim, approach the river's edge. The crowd that has followed them is a strange mix of morbid curiosity and silent, horrified awe. The body, now a mere lump of rotting flesh, is an object of revulsion, a symbol of how quickly power and sanctity can be undone. The sight of the cadaver being lifted and then tossed into the murky waters of the Tiber is a chilling and unforgettable one. There is no prayer, no final rites, just the awful, unceremonious splash of a body hitting the water. The river, which had flowed quietly for millennia, has now become a witness to a monstrous crime. And here's a quirky tidbit. The Tiber River, in ancient Roman times, was a place of ritual cleansing, but also a place where the bodies of criminals were often disposed of as a final form of dishonour. By throwing Formosus's body into the river, Stephen VI was not just getting rid of it. He was invoking a very old, very Roman tradition of dishonouring a man in the most public and contemptuous way possible. It was a fusion of Christian and pagan tradition, a chilling reminder that the old ways of vengeance were still very much alive and well in the 9th century. It's like a modern-day villain invoking a long-forgotten ancient law to justify a horrifying act. It's a bit of historical irony that a pope would use an ancient pagan custom to defile his predecessor. Historians still argue whether the Cadaver Synod and the subsequent desecration of Formosus's body were truly an act of unadulterated madness on Stephen VI's part, or if it was a calculated political move to scare his rivals into submission. Was Stephen a true believer in his own righteousness, a man so consumed by a fanatical vision of purity that he would go to these lengths? Or was he simply a cold, calculating politician using a theatrical act of violence to consolidate his power? The historical record is too thin to definitively say. What is clear, however, is that the act of throwing the body into the Tiber was a final theatrical flourish, a public display of power that was meant to be seen and remembered. The river takes the body, and for a moment there is a terrible silence. The crowd, the guards, everyone watches as the corpse sinks from view. The act is done. The Cadaver Synod is over, and the final ignominious chapter of Formosus's life has been written. But you, a silent observer, know that this is not the end of the story. The river, you know, is not a final resting place, and the memory of this act of sacrilege is not so easily washed away. The Roman people, who had been a passive and horrified audience, now feel a different emotion beginning to stir. The sight of a dead pope, a spiritual leader, being thrown into a river like a common criminal is a powerful and unsettling image. It's an act that has crossed a line, a violation of a fundamental belief that even the dead deserve respect. The shock and horror that had been suppressed during the trial now begin to bubble up into a new, dangerous emotion. Outrage. The people of Rome, who had been so terrified of Stephen VI and the Spoletan faction, now feel a different kind of fear, one that is mixed with a deep and righteous anger. The Cadaver Synod was meant to be a show of strength, a display of power, but in a strange and unforeseen twist, it has become a catalyst for a dangerous backlash. The river, which took the body, is about to give it back, and the consequences of that simple act will change the course of Roman history forever. The unholy waters of the Tiber have witnessed a crime, and now they are about to become the instrument of a strange and unexpected justice. The Cadaver Synod is a done deal, but the consequences, you know, are just beginning. The Cadaver Synod is over, but its dark, lingering shadow has settled over Rome. You stand by the banks of the Tiber, a silent observer of a city in the grip of a profound and unsettling change. The spectacle of a dead pope being tried, mutilated and thrown into a river was meant to be a show of force, a terrifying display of Pope Stephen VI's power. But it has backfired spectacularly. The initial terror of the Roman populace has given way to a deep, simmering outrage. The tide is turning, and the man who thought he had won is about to find out that his victory was a fatal miscalculation. Mainstream historical fact for you. The Cadaver Synod was widely seen as a monstrous and sacrilegious act, even by the standards of the politically brutal 9th century. The sheer, unprecedented horror of the event shocked the entire Christian world. The public reaction in Rome was particularly hostile. The common people, who had just a few months earlier stood in silent terror, now began to openly question the legitimacy of a pope who would desecrate a dead man. The sacrilege of the act, the violation of Christian burial traditions, was a bridge too far. The Cadaver Synod, intended to be a public display of power, had become a public relations nightmare. You can feel the mood of the city shifting. The hushed whispers in the alleyways are no longer about fear, they're about outrage. The priests and clergy, many of whom had been forced to participate in the synod under duress, now began to speak out against Stephen VI. They had been forced to watch their spiritual leader desecrate the body of his predecessor, and they felt a profound sense of shame and guilt. The Cadaver Synod was not just a political act, it was a spiritual crime, and it had left an indelible stain on the soul of the Church. The act was a clear violation of every known law, both divine and secular, and the Roman people were not going to forget it. And here's a quirky tidbit. A pious monk, a man whose name has been lost to history, is said to have had a vision that compelled him to act. According to legend, he scoured the banks of the Tiber until he found the body of Formosus, which had washed ashore. The body, still in its putrefied state, but with the severed fingers and other signs of desecration, was a chilling testament to Stephen's cruelty. The monk, horrified, took the body and hid it in a secret location, where he gave it a proper Christian burial. This act, however small, was a sign that the backlash was real. It was a symbolic rejection of Stephen's papacy and a quiet act of defiance against his tyranny. It was a man, a single, pious man, saying, "Enough is enough." Historians still argue whether the public's outrage was a spontaneous reaction to the sacrilege of the Cadaver Synod, or if it was a carefully orchestrated political campaign by Formosus's remaining allies. Was the public anger a genuine organic reaction, or was it a result of political manoeuvring by the opposition? The truth is likely a combination of both. Formosus had powerful allies, and they were not going to let this act of desecration stand. They used the public's outrage as a weapon, a powerful tool to turn the people against Stephen VI and the Spoletan faction. The Cadaver Synod was not just a historical event, it was a political earthquake, and the aftershocks were about to shake the very foundations of the Roman Church. The Spoletan faction, which had felt so invincible after Formosus's death, now finds itself on the defensive. Pope Stephen VI, once a feared and powerful figure, is now seen as a tyrant and a madman. His papacy, which had seemed so secure, is now in jeopardy. The very act he thought would cement his power has instead become the source of his undoing. The common people, emboldened by the growing opposition from the clergy and the nobles, begin to openly protest. They demand justice for the dead pope. They demand an end to Stephen's reign of terror. The Cadaver Synod was a turning point. It was a line that should have never been crossed, and in crossing it, Stephen VI sealed his own fate. The public outrage, which had been a quiet murmur just a few weeks earlier, now swells into a deafening roar. The Roman people, who had endured so much from their political leaders, had finally had enough. The desecration of a dead man, the violation of a tomb, was a clear sign that the moral compass of the Roman Church was broken. And the people, who had always looked to the Church for guidance, were now looking for a new leader, a new direction. The tide has turned. The political pendulum, which had swung so violently in favour of Stephen VI and the Spoletan family, is now swinging back, and it is swinging with a vengeance. The Cadaver Synod was an act of pure violence, a public lynching that was meant to terrify and intimidate. But it had the opposite effect. It awakened a sleeping giant, the collective conscience of the Roman people. And now, that giant is rising, and its fury is directed squarely at the man who thought he was a king, but who would soon find out he was nothing more than a villain in his own story. The stage is set for the final violent confrontation, and the fate of Pope Stephen VI, a man who had dared to put a corpse on trial, is about to be decided. The backlash has begun. The public outrage has reached a boiling point. The outrage over the Cadaver Synod, once a quiet murmur, has now become a deafening roar. You can feel the tension in the air, a sense of a city on the brink of revolt. The people, who had been cowed by the power of the Spoletan faction, are now united in their disgust and their anger. Pope Stephen VI, once so confident in his unholy victory, is now a man under siege. The very act he thought would secure his power has instead become the source of his undoing. Mainstream historical fact for you: the backlash against Pope Stephen VI was swift and decisive. The Roman populace, outraged by the sacrilegious Cadaver Synod, rose up against him. This was not a carefully planned coup d'etat. It was an organic, popular revolt, a spontaneous eruption of anger and disgust. The Roman people, who had just witnessed the public desecration of a dead pope, had finally had enough. They had endured political corruption, violence and short-lived papacies. but the violation of a tomb and the public mutilation of a body was a step too far. The Cadaver Synod was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. You watch as the popular revolt unfolds. The streets of Rome, which just weeks earlier had been a stage for Stephen's triumph, are now a place of protest and rebellion. Mobs gather, their anger fueled by a mix of righteous indignation and a long-simmering resentment of the Spolitan family's heavy-handed rule. They march on the Lateran Palace, the seat of papal power, a symbol of everything they now despise. The palace, which had once felt like a fortress of unassailable power, now feels like a prison. Stephen VI, the man who'd been so full of himself just weeks earlier, is now a frightened, cornered animal. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. The populace's outrage was so powerful that it was said to have been a miracle. According to some historical sources, a fisherman found the body of Formosus washed ashore on the banks of the Tiber, a sight that was seen as a sign from God. The body, though putrefied and mutilated, was still recognisable, and the sight of it reignited the people's fury. The cadaver, which had been a symbol of Stephen VI's victory, was now a powerful symbol of his monstrous crimes. It's like a villain's victim coming back from the dead to haunt him, a literal ghost in a story of power and revenge. The discovery of the body was a rallying cry for the revolt. It was a tangible, physical reminder of the sacrilege that had been committed. Historians still argue whether the revolt was a spontaneous act of the Roman people, or if it was a carefully orchestrated political manoeuvre by Formosus's remaining allies. While the people's outrage was genuine, it is also likely that Formosus's powerful friends, who had been lying in wait, used the public's fury as a convenient cover for their own political agenda. Was the revolt a grassroots movement, a true popular uprising against a tyrant, or was it a proxy war, a battle between two factions fought on the streets of Rome? The sources from the period are too thin to say for sure, but what is clear is that the Cadaver Synod had provided the spark that lit the political powder keg. The political and spiritual authority of Pope Stephen VI has evaporated. The bishops and cardinals who had been forced to participate in the Cadaver Synod now turn against him. They see that his power is gone, and they know that they must distance themselves from him if they are to survive the coming storm. The Spolitan family, the very force that had put him in power, now finds itself on the defensive. They realise that they have overplayed their hand and that their chosen pope has become a political liability. They abandon him, leaving him to face the mob alone. The mob, now emboldened by the lack of resistance, finally breaches the Lateran Palace. They storm the papal apartments, a furious tide of righteous anger. Pope Stephen VI is captured. A man who had once been the most powerful spiritual leader in the world, now a prisoner of his own people. The man who had put a dead pope on trial is now on trial himself, not in a formal courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, a court that is far more powerful and far more brutal. The collapse of Stephen VI's papacy is a swift and brutal one. The man who had sought to erase a dead pope from history now finds his own history being erased by the very people he had tried to terrorise. The Cadaver Synod, which was meant to be a permanent victory, has become a permanent defeat. The Roman people have spoken, and their verdict is a simple, brutal one. The man who had desecrated a tomb must face justice for his crimes. The mob, which had been so passive just a few weeks earlier, is now an unstoppable force, a testament to the power of a people united by a common outrage. The stage is set for the final, gruesome act of this dark drama. The tyrant is on his knees, and the Roman people are about to deliver their final judgment. The collapse of Pope Stephen VI's power has been swift and total. You're now inside a dank, unlit prison cell in a Roman dungeon. The man who just weeks earlier had been the most powerful spiritual leader in the world, the man who had dared to put a corpse on trial, is now a prisoner himself. His papal vestments have been replaced with rough rags, his papal ring is gone, and his face, once so full of a furious, unholy righteousness, is now a mask of terror and despair. The Cadaver Synod was meant to be his crowning achievement, a final, definitive act of power, but it has become his undoing. Mainstream historical fact for you. After being deposed by the Roman populace, Pope Stephen VI was imprisoned. The Roman people, now fully in control, were not interested in a formal trial or a legal process. They wanted a swift and brutal justice for the sacrilege he had committed. He was held in a dark cell, stripped of his dignity and his authority, a stark reminder of how quickly power could be lost in the tumultuous world of 9th century Rome. His imprisonment was a clear signal that the Cadaver Synod had been a monstrous act, a violation of the natural order that could not be forgiven. You can almost feel the cold dread that fills the cell. Stephen VI, once so arrogant and so full of himself, is now a broken man. He is no longer a pope, no longer a politician. He is a criminal, a prisoner awaiting his final judgment. The solitude and the darkness of the cell are a cruel irony. The man who had put a dead man on public trial is now to face his own end in secret, a silent victim of his own hubris. The sounds of the Roman mob, which had been so loud and so furious, have now faded into a low, menacing hum. Stephen is alone, with nothing but his own terrible thoughts to keep him company. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. According to some accounts, in his final days, Stephen VI began to hallucinate. He saw the spectral figure of Pope Formosus, his cadaverous face and shrunken body a terrifying sight in the darkness of the cell. The ghost, according to legend, would silently stare at him, a silent, terrible judge of the man who had desecrated him. It's a bit of historical folklore, sure, but it speaks to the profound psychological horror of what he had done. The cadaver he had so viciously condemned had now become a literal ghost, a spiritual haunting that followed him to his final, terrible moments. It's a story of a man being consumed by his own crime, a chilling reminder that some acts can never be undone. Historians still argue whether Pope Stephen VI's final days were a period of genuine remorse and penitence, or a simple terror of a man facing his own brutal end. Did he truly believe that he had sinned, or was he just afraid of what was to come? The sources from the period are too thin to say for sure, but the lack of resistance and the sheer terror that he displayed in his final moments suggest that he was not a martyr for a cause, but a man who had finally realised the full extent of his monstrous actions. The Cadaver Synod, which he had so fervently believed in, had become a noose around his own neck. He had thought he was a hero, a purifier of the church, but the rest of the world saw him as a villain, a monster who had gone too far. The final judgment on Pope Stephen VI is a swift and brutal one. The Roman people who had endured so much were not in a mood for mercy. The Cadaver Synod was a crime that demanded a punishment of equal weight. The man who had so viciously desecrated a dead man's body would not be given a dignified death. The prison cell, you know, is not a place of final rest. It's a prelude to something far more violent and far more terrible. The Cadaver Synod was a turning point, not just for the papacy, but for the history of papal punishments. It was a clear signal that even the highest authority could not get away with a crime of such sacrilege. The imprisonment of Stephen VI was a testament to the power of the Roman people, a show of force that would be remembered for centuries. The man who had been a tyrant was now a victim, a perfect example of a villain getting his just deserts. The end, you know, is coming. And it will be as brutal and as unceremonious as the end he had planned for Formosus. The Cadaver Synod was a show trial, and its violent end was a show of force. The Roman people had had enough of the political machinations and the endless parade of feuding popes. They wanted justice, and they were going to get it one way or another. Stephen VI, in his final moments, a shivering wreck of a man, would learn that the world he had created, a world of violence and vengeance, was now coming for him. The man who had dared to judge the dead was now about to be judged by the living, and his fate, you know, would be far more terrible than anything he had planned for his predecessor. The story, however, is far from over. This is not the end, it is just a terrible prelude. The Cadaver Synod, a monstrous act of sacrilege, had a bizarre and unforeseen consequence. It made a dead man an unexpected martyr. You stand by the Tiber River, the same place where just weeks earlier the body of Pope Formosus had been unceremoniously thrown. The popular revolt against Stephen VI has been swift and successful, and now the Roman people, in a strange and macabre twist, are looking for a sign, a tangible symbol of their victory. They find it, not in a new pope, but in the corpse of the old one. The river, which was meant to be a final, unholy grave, has become a place of a strange and miraculous resurrection. Mainstream historical fact for you. According to multiple historical accounts, the body of Pope Formosus was recovered from the Tiber River by a pious hermit or monk. The body had not been carried far by the current, and it had somehow been freed from its weights. The discovery of the body was seen by many as a miracle, a sign of divine disapproval of the Cadaver Synod, and a clear signal that Formosus was innocent of the charges against him. The cadaver, now a symbol of martyrdom and injustice, was a powerful rallying cry for the new papal regime. The cadaver, which had been a tool of Stephen VI's vengeance, was now a weapon against him. You watch as the body is brought back to shore. It's a surreal and deeply moving scene. The fisherman or monk who found the body is treated like a hero, a man who had done a great service to God and to the Roman people. The cadaver, though still in a state of decay and with the marks of desecration, is no longer a symbol of shame. It's a symbol of divine justice, a testament to the fact that even in the most corrupt and violent of times, God's hand can still be seen at work. The body is treated with a new sense of reverence, a stark contrast to the way it had been treated just weeks earlier. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. According to legend, when the body of Formosus was brought back to St. Peter's Basilica, it performed miracles. When the cadaver was carried past other graves, the saints in those tombs were said to have turned their heads and bowed in reverence. This is, of course, a piece of historical folklore, but it speaks volumes about the popular perception of the event. Formosus, a man who had been condemned as a heretic, was now seen as a saint, a man who had suffered a great injustice. The Cadaver Synod was meant to erase him from history, but it had the opposite effect. It elevated him to the status of a martyr. Historians still argue whether the story of the miracles was a genuine popular belief or a piece of propaganda designed by Formosus's allies to turn the public against the now deposed Stephen VI. Was the miraculous discovery of the body a genuine act of divine intervention? Or was it a carefully orchestrated event, a political stunt designed to cement the new regime's power? The sources are too biased to say for sure. But what is clear is that the story of the cadaver's resurrection was a powerful one, and it served to further legitimize the downfall of Stephen VI and the rise of the new political order. The cadaver, now revered as a holy relic, is taken back to St. Peter's Basilica, the very place from which it had been exhumed. The cadaver is given a solemn reburial, a final act of respect for a man who had been so horribly disrespected. The scene is a powerful one, a complete reversal of the Cadaver Synod. The church, which had been a stage for desecration, is now a place of solemn reverence. The cadaver, once a symbol of shame, is now a symbol of triumph. The political situation in Rome is now in a state of utter chaos. The Spoletan faction is in disarray, and a new pope, a man named Romanus, has taken the papal throne. The cadaver's resurrection, as it has come to be known, is his greatest weapon. By honouring the dead man, he is showing the Roman people that his papacy is a new one, a righteous one, a repudiation of everything that Stephen VI had stood for. The cadaver, once a piece of political garbage, is now a powerful symbol of the new political order. It's a bit of cosmic irony, a dead man's body becoming the single most important tool in a living man's political arsenal. The Cadaver Synod was a great political and spiritual crime, but it was also a historical event of great consequence. It showed how far a pope could go, and it also showed that the people had their limits. The cadaver's resurrection was the people's answer, a clear and decisive repudiation of a monstrous act. It was a testament to the fact that, even in the darkest of times, there is still a hope for justice. The cadaver of Formosus, a man who had been a victim of a horrible injustice, had now become an instrument of a strange and unexpected justice. His story, however, is not quite over. The cadaver's resurrection was a powerful symbol, but the political fallout would continue for years to come. The Cadaver Synod, a monstrous act of sacrilege, would have a long and turbulent legacy, a legacy of political chaos and a search for a new moral compass for the Roman Church. The Cadaver Synod has passed, and its horrifying legacy has been made clear to all of Rome. The cadaver of Formosus has been resurrected, and Pope Stephen VI has been deposed. The political pendulum, having swung so violently to the Spoletan side, is now swinging back, and with it comes a reckoning. The Roman Church and its new leaders must now deal with the unprecedented fallout of the trial. The very foundations of papal authority have been shaken, and now it is up to the new papacy to restore order and legitimacy. Mainstream historical fact for you. After the deposition and death of Stephen VI, the papacy entered a period of extreme instability. The short-lived papacy of Pope Romanus, who immediately reversed the actions of Stephen VI, was followed by the papacy of Pope Theodore II, who also reigned for just a few months. Theodore II had Formosus's body solemnly reburied in St. Peter's Basilica in the original papal robes he had been stripped of. The Cadaver Synod was officially condemned as a monstrous act, and its decrees were declared null and void. The Church was trying to clean up a political and spiritual mess that had left a permanent stain on its reputation. It was a clear and decisive repudiation of Stephen VI's actions, a desperate attempt to restore a sense of sanity and order. You watch as the new popes, one after another, try to undo the damage. It's like watching someone try to put a shattered vase back together. They can mend the pieces, but the cracks will always be there. Pope Romanus, a man of conscience, was the first to act. He annulled all of Stephen VI's acts, including the decrees of the Cadaver Synod. He was trying to turn back the clock, to pretend the whole horrible episode had never happened. But the political situation was too unstable for his papacy to last. He was in office for just a few months before he too was deposed, a victim of the same political chaos that had brought Stephen VI to power. The lesson was clear. In 9th century Rome, no papacy was safe, no legacy was secure. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. The political chaos that followed the Cadaver Synod was so intense that the papacy became a kind of political hot potato. Over a period of just a few years, there were a half-dozen popes, each one more short-lived than the last. The See of Peter, which was supposed to be a bastion of stability, became a revolving door of political intrigue, assassinations and depositions. It was a bizarre kind of papal musical chairs, with the person who landed on the throne often ending up dead or deposed just a few months later. This period of extreme instability, a direct result of the Cadaver Synod, would come to be known as the Saculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age. Historians still argue whether the string of short-lived popes was a result of a direct power struggle between the Spoletan and Formosan factions, or if it was just a symptom of a deeper political decay in Rome. Was each new pope a pawn in a larger game, or was the system so fundamentally broken that no single person could hold power for long? The historical record is fragmented, but the pattern is undeniable. The Cadaver Synod was not just a one-off event, it was a catalyst for a long and bloody period of instability that would take decades to resolve. The ghosts of Formosus and Stephen VI were still haunting the Lateran Palace, and the political infighting was the manifestation of their spiritual struggle. The Cadaver Synod had a profound impact on the legal and theological traditions of the Church. The trial was so far outside the bounds of established law that it forced later popes to officially condemn it. Pope John IX, a later pope, held a synod that explicitly and formally annulled the Cadaver Synod. He decreed that no pope should ever be put on trial posthumously again. This was a clear message that the Church had learned its lesson. The Cadaver Synod was not to be repeated. It was a recognition that what had been done was not just politically inexpedient, but a profound and fundamental spiritual crime. The papal reckoning was a slow and painful process. The Church had to re-establish its moral and legal authority, to convince the Christian world that its leaders were not just a collection of ruthless, power-hungry politicians. The Cadaver Synod had been a public display of the Church's ugliest side, and the healing process would take years, if not decades. The memory of the Cadaver Synod would be a permanent stain on the Church's reputation, a reminder of what could happen when political power was left unchecked. And yet, the story is not one of unmitigated failure. In a strange and unforeseen way, the Cadaver Synod was a catalyst for a new sense of legal and spiritual order. The very horror of the event forced the Church to re-evaluate its traditions and to put new protections in place to prevent such an event from ever happening again. The papal reckoning was a dark and painful process, but it was also a necessary one. The Church, which had been so close to collapse, had been given a chance to learn from its mistakes. The Cadaver Synod, a monstrous act of sacrilege, had become a terrible but essential lesson, a dark chapter that would forever be a part of the Church's history. The story, however, is not quite over. The Cadaver Synod had a lasting impact that went far beyond the Roman Church. Its legacy would be felt for centuries to come, a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the fragile nature of justice. The Cadaver Synod is more than just a bizarre historical event. It is a profound lesson in the fragility of justice and the corrupting influence of unchecked power. You stand in the long shadow of this terrible episode, and you can see its long-term effects on the Roman Church and on the very concept of law. The Cadaver Synod was a singular moment of madness, but it left a legacy of lawlessness that would take centuries to overcome. It was a clear signal that the rule of law, even within the sacred halls of the Church, was no match for raw political power and personal vengeance. Mainstream historical fact for you. The The Cadaver Synod was a legal and spiritual disaster that had no precedent in church history. It was a clear violation of every known canon law, and its repercussions were felt for centuries. The trial led to a period of intense instability in the papacy, known as the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age, where popes were frequently deposed, murdered, or imprisoned. The Cadaver Synod had so delegitimised the papal office that it became a plaything for powerful Roman families, each vying for control of the ultimate spiritual prize. The trial had shown that papal power was not divinely ordained, but a political football to be fought over with any means necessary. You can see the direct line from the Cadaver Synod to the chaos that followed. The moment Pope Stephen VI put a dead man on trial, he had opened a Pandora's box of legal and spiritual contradictions. If a pope could be deposed and condemned after death, then what was the point of papal infallibility? If a pope's acts could be retroactively nullified, what was the point of his authority? The Cadaver Synod had not just condemned a man, it had condemned the very idea of a stable, consistent papal office. It was a political earthquake, and the aftershocks would continue for decades. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. The Cadaver Synod was so infamous that later medieval canon lawyers and historians would use it as a case study for what not to do. The trial became a famous example of a juridical abomination, a clear case of legal perversion that was used to teach future generations about the dangers of mixing political power with legal authority. It was a kind of historical horror story, a moral fable that was used to warn future popes and rulers against the kind of behaviour that Stephen VI had engaged in. The name Cadaver Synod itself became a byword for unholy and unjust proceedings. Historians still argue whether the Cadaver Synod was an aberration, a strange and isolated moment in history, or if it was the culmination of a long period of political decay in the Roman Church. Was it a one-off event, or was it the natural result of decades of political violence and moral decay? The sources from the period are too biased to say for sure, but the Cadaver Synod was a clear sign that the Roman Church had reached a new low. It was a dark and terrible moment that would forever be a black mark on the Church's reputation. It was a reminder that even the highest spiritual office was not immune to the darkest impulses of human nature. The Cadaver Synod had a profound impact on the concept of papal authority itself. The fact that a pope could be deposed and condemned by another pope in such a bizarre and unjust way had a chilling effect. It showed that the office of the papacy was not a divine right, but a political prize, to be won by force and to be held at the pleasure of the Roman nobility. The Cadaver Synod was a wake-up call, a clear signal that the Church had to reform its ways if it was to survive. The papal reckoning was not just about deposing a single man, it was about re-establishing the moral and legal authority of the papacy itself. The legacy of lawlessness that the Cadaver Synod left behind was a long and difficult one to overcome. It would take a series of reform-minded popes decades later to finally put the Church on a more stable footing. They would have to rebuild the moral authority of the papacy to convince the Christian world that the Church was not just a political machine, but a spiritual one. The Cadaver Synod was a terrible but essential lesson, a dark chapter that would forever be a part of the Church's history. It was a reminder that even in the most sacred of institutions, justice could be perverted and vengeance could triumph. You watch as the story winds down. The Cadaver Synod is over. The actors are gone, but its legacy remains. It's a legacy of legal chaos, spiritual instability, and a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. The Cadaver Synod was a terrible event, but it was also a historical turning point. It forced the Church to look at itself in a mirror and to finally deal with the profound moral and political decay that had been festering for decades. The Cadaver Synod, a monstrous act of sacrilege, had become a catalyst for a long and painful but necessary reform. The story, however, is not quite over. The Cadaver Synod had a lasting impact that went far beyond the Roman Church. Its legacy would be felt for centuries to come, a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the fragile nature of justice. The story of the Cadaver Synod is now drawing to a close, but its bizarre, far-reaching legacy continues to echo through history. You stand at the end of this journey, looking back at a moment of profound madness that became a catalyst for change. The trial of a dead pope, an act so shocking and unprecedented, has a final lesson to teach us about the nature of power, justice, and the strange twists of human history. This is not just a tale of a long-dead pope. It is a story of a moment when the very idea of justice was tested and found wanting, and its aftermath forced a reckoning that would shape the future of the Roman Church and beyond. Mainstream historical fact for you. The Cadaver Synod is widely considered one of the most bizarre and grotesque events in the history of the papacy. It remains a famous example of a juridical abomination and a case study in the dangers of combining unchecked political power with religious authority. The sheer absurdity of the event, a live pope yelling at a corpse in a courtroom, has made it a memorable, if horrifying, episode. Its infamy has ensured its place in historical accounts, often used as a dramatic example of the political corruption and moral decay of the 9th century. The story has been told and retold for centuries, a historical horror story that continues to fascinate and appall. You reflect on the key players in this drama. There was Pope Formosus, a man of ambition and political cunning who, in death, became an unwitting martyr. His cadaver, a silent, passive victim, became the central figure in a drama that was far larger than himself. He was a symbol of a papacy that had become a political battlefield, and his posthumous trial was the final, desperate act of a dying political order. His quiet, dignified reburial after the cadaver's resurrection was a powerful symbol of the Roman people's rejection of Stephen VI's madness. His story is a poignant one, a reminder that even in the face of terrible injustice, there is still hope for a kind of twisted historical justice. And then there was Pope Stephen VI, a man consumed by a terrifying righteous rage. His hatred for Formosus was so powerful that it drove him to commit an act that would forever be a stain on the history of the papacy. His descent from a powerful pontiff to a broken man in a dungeon is a classic tale of hubris, a cautionary tale about a man who was so sure of his own righteousness that he could not see the madness of his actions. His gruesome end was a brutal form of poetic justice, a clear sign that the Roman people would not tolerate a tyrant who had gone too far. His story is a chilling reminder of the dangers of mixing political power with a perverted sense of religious zeal. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. The Cadaver Synod was such a notorious event that some later medieval writers and canon lawyers would refer to it as the Synodus Horrenda, or the Horrifying Synod. The name itself is a testament to the fact that even at the time, people were well aware that this was not a normal legal or religious proceeding. The name stuck, and for centuries afterward, it was a shorthand for a perverted and unjust legal proceeding. It's like a historical nickname that perfectly encapsulates a person's or event's reputation, a name so fitting that it continues to be used centuries later. The Cadaver Synod was so far outside the bounds of established law and morality that it had to be given a name that reflected its sheer monstrosity. Historians still argue about the true motivations of the various players in this drama. Was Pope Stephen VI truly a deranged fanatic, or was he a cold, calculating politician using a theatrical act of violence to secure his power? Was the Roman mob a grassroots movement of righteous indignation, or was it a carefully orchestrated political campaign by Formosus's allies? The sources from this period are too biased and fragmented to give us a definitive answer. The Cadaver Synod is a historical puzzle, a confusing mix of political intrigue, religious fanaticism, and sheer, unadulterated madness. It's a moment in history that defies easy explanation and continues to be debated and studied by historians to this day. The legacy of history's weirdest trial is a powerful and enduring one. It was a catalyst for a long and painful period of reform in the Roman Church, a necessary reckoning that forced later popes to re-evaluate the nature of papal authority and the rule of law. The Cadaver Synod was a clear sign that the Church had lost its way, and the brutal backlash that followed was the first step on a long and difficult road to recovery. The trial of a dead pope was not just a historical curiosity, it was a turning point, a moment when the Church, in its darkest hour, was forced to confront its own moral and political decay. As the story fades, you're left with a final thought. The Cadaver Synod was a monstrous act of sacrilege, a moment when vengeance triumphed over justice, and when the dead were not even allowed to rest in peace. But it was also a story of redemption, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times there is a hope for justice. The cadaver of Formosus, a man who had been a victim of a horrible injustice, had become an instrument of a strange and unexpected justice. His story is a final, chilling reminder that the past is never truly dead, and that even a dead man's memory can become a powerful force for change. The story of the Cadaver Synod is a dark and terrible one, but it is also a powerful and enduring one. And with that, the strange and unsettling history of history's weirdest trial comes to a close. Welcome back from the 9th century, fellow traveller. That was quite a journey, wasn't it? The air here is a little cleaner, the rules a little more predictable, and you can generally count on a corpse staying put after it's been buried. It's a nice change of pace. I hope the story wasn't too wild for your sleepy head. The Cadaver Synod is one of those moments that really reminds you just how fragile order and reason can be, and how a little bit of hatred can grow into something truly, utterly monstrous. But remember, for all the darkness in history, there's always a light of humanity that finds its way through, a quiet monk on a riverbank, a people rising up in outrage, a new generation trying to do better. So as you drift off, let the wildness of it all fade into a quiet hum. Just remember the strange dance between the living and the dead, the power of a story that refuses to be silenced, and the comforting knowledge that no one is going to drag you out of bed for a trial. The curtains are closing on tonight's tale. You are safe. You are warm. You are where you need to be. Just breathe and rest and dream.